Margaret Thornton wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stood in her small kitchen, looking out at the endless wheat fields that stretched toward the horizon. The morning sun was already beating down hard, and she knew it was going to be another scorching day in Nebraska. At 32 years old, she felt much older than her years. 8 months had passed since her husband died in that terrible accident with the farm equipment, and every single day since then had been a struggle. She turned away from the window and looked at the pile of papers on her kitchen table. Bank notices, overdue bills, and letters from creditors stared back at her like angry faces. Each piece of paper told the same story. Without a man to help her run the farm, she was going to lose everything. The thought made her stomach twist with worry. Her 2 children were still sleeping upstairs. Little Samuel was only 6 years old, and her daughter Lucy was just 4. They were too young to understand how bad things really were. Margaret tried to keep them happy and fed, but she could see the questions in their eyes when she served them smaller portions at dinner or when she mended their clothes for the 3rd time instead of buying new ones. The farm work was backbreaking. Every morning, Margaret got up before sunrise to milk the cows, feed the chickens, and tend to the crops. Her hands were rough and cracked from the hard work, and her back ached constantly. She had tried to hire help, but she simply didn't have the money to pay a farmhand. The few neighbors who had offered to help in the beginning had their own farms to worry about, and she couldn't keep asking for their charity. Margaret walked to the stove and poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot she had made with yesterday's. Grounds coffee was expensive, and she had to make every bit count. As she sipped the weak brew, she thought about her late husband, Robert. He had been a good man, hard-working and kind. They had bought this farm together with such big dreams. They were going to raise their children here, grow old together, and build something lasting. Now those dreams felt like they were slipping through her fingers like sand. The sound of footsteps on the porch made her look up. Through the window, she saw her neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, walking toward the house. The older woman was carrying a basket, probably filled with vegetables from her garden. Mrs. Henderson had been very kind since Robert's death, often bringing food and checking on the family. "Good morning, Margaret," Mrs. Henderson called out as she knocked on the door. "Come in, please," Margaret replied, smoothing down her worn dress and trying to look more composed than she felt. Mrs. Henderson entered the kitchen and set her basket on the counter. "I brought you some fresh tomatoes and corn," she said, then paused and looked at Margaret with concern. "You look tired, dear. How are you holding up?" Margaret tried to smile, but she could feel tears threatening to spill over. "I'm managing," she said quietly, though they both knew it wasn't true. Mrs. Henderson sat down at the kitchen table and gestured for Margaret to join her. "I've been thinking about your situation," she said gently. "I know it's not easy for a woman to run a farm alone, especially with 2 small children." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She had been thinking the same thing every day for months. "There might be a solution," Mrs. Henderson continued, lowering her voice. "I know it might sound strange, but have you ever thought about finding another husband?" Margaret's eyes widened. I don't know anyone who would want to marry a widow with 2 children and a failing farm," she said. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward. "That's not what I mean," she said. "I'm talking about placing an advertisement in one of those Eastern newspapers. There are plenty of good men back east who are looking for a fresh start out here in the West. Men who would be happy to marry a good woman and help her with her farm." Margaret stared at her neighbor in shock. She had heard whispers about such arrangements, but she had never imagined herself in that situation. "You mean ... a mail-order marriage?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, it sounds frightening," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. "But think about it, Margaret. You need help, and there are men who need what you can offer: a home, a family, a chance to build something together. It's not so different from how marriages used to be arranged in the old days." Margaret's mind was racing. The idea seemed both terrifying and hopeful at the same time. Could she really marry a complete stranger? What if he was cruel to her children? What if he was dishonest or lazy? But then again, what choice did she have? If she lost the farm, where would she and the children go? Over the next few days, Margaret couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Henderson's suggestion. She watched other families in town, the husbands working alongside their wives, the children playing happily in yards where both parents could provide for them. She saw what she was missing, what her children were missing. One evening, after putting the children to bed, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a piece of paper and a pencil. Her hands shook as she tried to write the words that could change her life forever. How do you advertise for a husband? What do you say about yourself? How do you explain that you're not looking for love, but for partnership and survival? She started and stopped several times, crumpling up failed attempts and throwing them into the fire. Finally, she managed to write something simple and honest. Widow with farm and 2 children, seeks honest, hard-working man for marriage and partnership. Must be willing to work the land and provide for family. Serious inquiries only. Margaret stared at the words for a long time. They seemed so cold and businesslike, but she didn't know how else to put it. She wasn't looking for romance. She was looking for someone who could help her save her family's future. The next morning, she walked into town and handed the advertisement to the newspaper editor, along with enough money to have it published in several Eastern papers. Her heart was pounding as she watched him read it, but he just nodded and said it would go out with the next batch of regional advertisements. For 3 weeks, Margaret waited anxiously for any response. Every day she walked to the post office. The children noticed her nervousness and asked if she was feeling sick. She told them she was just worried about the crops, which wasn't entirely a lie. Then, on a Tuesday morning in late summer, the postmaster handed her an envelope with her name written in careful, neat handwriting. Margaret's hands trembled as she opened it right there in the post office. The letter was from a man named Thomas McKenna in Boston. He wrote that he was a carpenter by trade, 28 years old, and looking for a chance to start over in the West. He said he had always wanted a family and would be honored to provide for her and her children. His handwriting was careful and educated, and his words were respectful and kind. Margaret read the letter 3 times before walking home. That night, she wrote back, telling him more about the farm and her children. She tried to be honest about the challenges they would face together, but also hopeful about what they could build. Their correspondence continued for 2 months. Thomas wrote about his carpentry skills and his dream of having land of his own. Margaret wrote about her children's personalities and the rhythm of farm life. Slowly, through their letters, they began to know each other in a way that felt both strange and natural. With each letter, Margaret felt a growing sense of hope. Thomas seemed kind and hard-working, and he wrote about her children as if he was already looking forward to being their father. Maybe, just maybe, this crazy plan might actually work. The October morning air was crisp and cool as Margaret stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her best blue dress for the 3rd time. Her hands were shaking, and she couldn't seem to get the buttons straight. Today was the day, Thomas. McKenna would arrive on the morning train from Boston, and she felt like her whole future was riding on the next few hours. She had been awake since before dawn, pacing around the house and checking everything twice. The kitchen was spotless. Fresh bread was cooling on the counter, and she had even picked wildflowers to put in a jar on the table. Margaret wanted everything to be perfect when Thomas saw his new home for the first time. Her 2 children, Lucy and Samuel, were dressed in their Sunday clothes and sitting quietly at the kitchen table. They had been asking questions about a stranger who was coming to live with them for weeks now. Margaret had tried to explain as best she could that Thomas was going to help them with the farm and maybe become their new father. She could see the uncertainty in their young faces. "Mama, what if we don't like him?" Lucy asked, swinging her legs from her chair. Margaret knelt down beside her daughter and smoothed her hair. "Well, honey, we're going to give him a chance to show us what kind of person he is. Sometimes good. People don't look exactly like what we expect." She had no idea how true those words would turn out to be. The walk to the train station felt both too long and too short. Margaret's mind kept racing with all the things that could go wrong. What if Thomas changed his mind when he saw her? What if he was nothing like his letters? What if he took one look at the small town and decided to get right back on the train? But she also found herself daydreaming about the possibilities. In his letters, Thomas had written about building a proper chicken coop and fixing the barn roof before winter. He had asked thoughtful questions about the children's schooling and promised to teach Samuel how to work with wood. Margaret had started to imagine conversations over dinner, help with the endless farm chores, maybe even someone to talk to in the evenings after the children went to bed. The train station was busier than usual that morning. Several families were waiting for relatives, and there was a group of well-dressed businessmen heading to the state capitol. Margaret positioned herself where she could see everyone getting off the train. With Lucy and Samuel standing close beside her, when the train's whistle echoed across the prairie, Margaret's heart started beating so fast she thought everyone around her must be able to hear it. Black smoke poured from the engine as it pulled into the station with a great hissing of steam and squealing of brakes. The conductor jumped down and placed a small step stool by the passenger car door. Margaret watched carefully as people began stepping off the train. First came the businessmen, looking important in their pressed suits and shiny shoes. Then several women in fancy traveling dresses, followed by a family with matching luggage. Margaret scanned each face, looking for the man she had been picturing. In her mind for the past 2 months, she had imagined Thomas as a well-dressed gentleman, perhaps wearing a nice coat and carrying a leather satchel. In her dreams, he would step confidently off the train, spot her immediately, and greet her with a warm smile. They would walk back to the farm together, talking easily like old friends, and everything would fall naturally into place. But as the well-dressed passengers dispersed into the crowd, Margaret began to worry. Where was Thomas? Had he missed the train? Changed his mind? Maybe he had taken one look at the small prairie town from the train window and decided this wasn't the life he wanted after all. Just as she was starting to panic, she noticed movement near the freight car at the back of the train. A tall, thin man was climbing down, not from the passenger car, but from the same car where they loaded livestock and cargo. He was carrying what looked like an old canvas bag, the kind that soldiers might use, and his clothes were clearly worn and patched. Margaret's first thought was that this must be a drifter looking for work. It's the kind of man who rode the rails and slept in barns. She was about to turn away when the man started walking in her direction, his eyes scanning the crowd. As he got closer, she could see his face more clearly, thin from hunger, weathered by hardship, but with kind eyes that seemed familiar somehow. "Mrs. Thornton," he said quietly, stopping a few feet away and removing his hat. Margaret felt her heart sink to her stomach. This couldn't be Thomas McKenna, the educated carpenter who had written such thoughtful letters. This man looked like he hadn't had a good meal in weeks. His coat was clean, but had been mended so many times that it was more patches than original fabric. His boots were worn thin at the soles, and she could see where he had tried to polish them for this important meeting, but they were clearly on their last legs. "I'm Thomas McKenna," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "I fear I am not what you were expecting." The crowd around them seemed to grow quiet, and Margaret could feel people staring. She heard one woman whisper to her companion, "Can you believe that? A mail-order husband who looks like a beggar." Another person muttered something about desperate women taking in strays. Lucy pressed closer to Margaret's skirt, and Samuel grabbed her hand tightly. Margaret could see the shame in Thomas's eyes as he noticed the stares and whispers. His shoulders sagged, and he seemed to shrink into himself. "I lost my carpentry business 6 months ago," Thomas said, his voice full of pain. "My partner cheated me out of everything I had worked for. I've been living. I've been getting by however I could. I spent my last dollar on the train fare to get here, hoping that maybe I could start over." Margaret stood frozen, her mind spinning. This was not the man she had been expecting. The Thomas in her imagination had been prosperous and confident, someone who could step in and solve all her problems. Instead, she was looking at a man who seemed to have even more problems than she did. "Mrs. Thornton," Thomas continued, twisting his hat in his hands. "I know I don't look like much right now. I know you probably want me to get back on that train and disappear. But I swear to you, if you'll give me a chance, I will work harder than any man you've ever known. I'll earn my place in your family. I'll prove that I'm worth more than these old clothes." The sincerity in his voice made Margaret's chest tighten. She could see that beneath the worn clothing and thin frame, there was a man who had been beaten down by life, but hadn't given up hope. His eyes held the same kindness that had come through in his letters, the same gentle strength that had made her believe he could be a good father to her children. But she was also acutely aware of the whispers around them, the disapproving looks. from the other townspeople. How could she bring this man home? What would the neighbors say? What would the children think? "Mama," Lucy whispered, tugging on her dress. "Is that him? Is that the man who's going to live with us?" Margaret looked down at her daughter's confused face, then back at Thomas. He was watching the children with such longing and hope that it made her heart ache. Whatever had happened to him, whatever had brought him to this desperate state, she could see that his feelings for her family were real. Double quotes Margaret started, then stopped. Her practical side was screaming at her to send him away, to wait for someone better. But her heart was telling her something different. This man had traveled halfway across the country with nothing but hope and determination. He had been honest about his situation when he could have tried to hide it. The train whistle blew again, signaling that it would be leaving soon. Thomas looked back at the train, then at Margaret, waiting for her decision. The moment stretched out like an eternity. Finally, Margaret took a deep breath. "Mr. McKenna," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "I think we should talk."
What?
"You like to come home with us for dinner?" The relief that flooded Thomas's face was so intense that Margaret had to look away. "Thank you," he whispered. "You won't regret this, Mrs. Thornton. I promise you won't regret this." As they walked away from the train station together, Margaret carrying herself with as much dignity as she could manage, Thomas walking quietly beside her with his worn canvas bag, and the children trailing behind with wide, curious eyes, Margaret wondered if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or the best decision she'd ever made. Only time would tell. The walk home from the train station was the longest 15 minutes of Margaret's life. She could feel the eyes of half the town watching them as they made their way down Main Street. Mrs. Peterson stopped sweeping her porch to stare openly at Thomas's patched clothes. Old Mr. Jenkins actually stepped out of his store to get a better look. Shaking his head in disapproval, Margaret kept her chin up and walked steadily forward. But inside, she was dying of embarrassment. What had she done? What would people think of her for bringing home a man who looked like he'd been living on the streets? Her cheeks burned with shame, but every time she glanced at Thomas walking quietly beside her, she saw something that made her keep going. He wasn't hanging his head in defeat. Instead, he was looking around at everything with genuine interest. The neat houses, the well-tended gardens, the wide prairie stretching beyond the town. When little Lucy stumbled over a loose board in the sidewalk, Thomas was there instantly, steadying her with a gentle hand. When Samuel dropped his wooden toy horse, Thomas picked it up and handed it back with a kind smile. "Thank you, mister," Samuel said shyly. "You're very welcome," Thomas replied. "That's a fine horse you have there. Did someone make it for you?" "Papa did before he went to heaven," Samuel answered. Thomas nodded seriously. He must have been a good man to make something so special. "I bet he would want you to take good care of it." Margaret felt her throat tighten. In all her worrying about what Thomas looked like, she had almost forgotten the gentle way he had written about children in his letters. When they reached the farm, Margaret hesitated at the gate. Once she brought Thomas through that gate, there would be no hiding what she had done. The neighbors would know she had taken in a stranger, a man who clearly had nothing to offer but his willingness to work. "Mrs. Thornton," Thomas said quietly, "I know this is hard for you. If you want me to leave, I understand. I can work for my meals for a few days and then move on. You don't owe me anything." Margaret looked at his thin face, at the kindness in his tired eyes, and made her decision. "Mr. McKenna," she said firmly, "I offered you dinner, and I keep my promises. Come inside." The next few hours were awkward for everyone. Thomas sat carefully on the edge of his chair at the kitchen table, as if he was afraid he might break something. The children stared at him openly, trying to figure out this strange man who had come to live with them. Margaret bustled around the kitchen, serving the meal she had prepared. But she was so nervous she nearly dropped the pot of stew twice. Thomas ate slowly and gratefully, complimenting every dish. "This is the best meal I've had in months," he said honestly. "You're a wonderful cook, Mrs. Thornton." After dinner, Margaret showed him to the barn where he would sleep. She had prepared a clean area with fresh hay and some old blankets, but seeing it through his eyes, it looked shabby and inadequate. "This is perfect," Thomas said, setting down his canvas bag. It's warm and dry, and that's more than I've had in a long time, thank you. That night, Margaret lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering what she had gotten herself into. Through her bedroom window, she could see a faint light in the barn where Thomas was probably trying to get comfortable. On his bed of hay? What kind of man was he really? What if he stole from them in the night and disappeared? What if he was dangerous? But when she woke up the next morning and looked outside, Thomas was already up and working. He'd found a hammer and some nails in the barn and was fixing the broken fence posts that had been falling down for months. He worked steadily and skillfully, and Margaret could see that he really did know what he was doing. Over the next few days, Margaret watched Thomas carefully, looking for any sign that she had made a mistake. Instead, she began to see the man he had described in his letters. He was up before dawn every morning, working on whatever needed to be done around the farm. He repaired the barn roof that had been leaking since the spring rains, fixed the squeaky hinges on the chicken coop door. He even built a small step stool for Lucy so she could reach the water pump by herself. What impressed Margaret most was how he worked. Thomas never complained, never asked for breaks, and never acted like any job was beneath him. When the cow got loose and wandered into the neighbor's cornfield, Thomas spent 2 hours chasing her back home, getting covered in mud in the process. When the outhouse door came off its hinges, he fixed it immediately without being asked. But it was his interactions with the children that really began to change Margaret's mind. Thomas had a natural way with Lucy and Samuel that surprised her. He never talked down to them or ignored them like some adults did. Instead, he listened to their endless questions and stories with genuine interest. One evening, Margaret found Thomas sitting on the porch steps with Samuel, showing him how to carve a simple whistle from a piece of wood. The boy was concentrating so hard on following Thomas's instructions that his tongue was sticking out of the corner of his mouth. Like this? Samuel asked, holding up his carving. Exactly like that, Thomas said proudly. You're a natural at this. Your father would be proud of how well you're learning. Margaret watched from the doorway as Thomas guided Samuel's small hands, showing him how to make smooth cuts in the wood. There was something so peaceful about the scene, so right, that it made her chest feel tight with emotion. Lucy was drawn to Thomas too, though in a different way. She had always been a shy child, but something about Thomas's quiet manner made her feel safe. She started following him around the farm, chattering about her dolls and her favorite flowers. Thomas listened to every word as if it was the most important thing he had ever heard. Mr. Thomas, Lucy said one afternoon as he was chopping wood for the winter, do you like living with us? Thomas stopped chopping and knelt down to her level. I like it very much, he said seriously. This is the nicest home I've ever had, and you and Samuel are the sweetest children I've ever met. Are you going to stay forever? She asked Thomas. Glanced toward the house where Margaret was hanging laundry on the line. I hope so, he said quietly. I hope so very much. As the weeks passed, Margaret found herself relying on Thomas more and more, not just for the physical work, though he had accomplished more in a month than she had managed in the previous 6 months alone. It was the small things that meant the most. When she was struggling to carry a heavy bucket of water from the well, Thomas appeared at her side to help without being asked. When she was worried about the chickens acting strange, Thomas figured out that they had mites and knew exactly how to treat them. One evening, after the children had gone to bed, Margaret and Thomas sat on the front porch talking about plans for the spring planting. Margaret found herself actually enjoying the conversation, something she hadn't experienced since her husband died. Thomas had ideas about crop rotation and soil improvement that showed he had been thinking seriously. About the farm's future? I've been wondering, Margaret said carefully, about your carpentry business back in Boston. What happened exactly? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the dark fields. I trusted the wrong person, he said finally. My business partner convinced me to put everything we owned up as collateral for a big contract. Then he disappeared with the advance money, leaving me responsible for all the debts. I lost my shop, my tools, my home, everything. That must have been terrible, Margaret said softly. It was, Thomas admitted. But in a strange way, it brought me here to you and the children. Maybe it was meant to happen. Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. Thomas, she said, using his first name for the first time, I owe you an apology. When you got off that train, I was so disappointed. I had built up this picture in my mind of who you would be, and when you didn't match it, I almost sent you away. Thomas turned to look at her. I don't blame you for that. No, I'm not much to look at right now. But that's just it, Margaret continued. You are much more than I expected. You're kinder, more hardworking, and better with the children than I dared to hope. I was looking at your clothes instead of looking at you. Thomas smiled, the first real smile she had seen from him since he arrived. Does this mean I can stay? Margaret smiled back. I think we need to talk about making this arrangement more permanent. November came to Nebraska with a fury that no one had expected. The first storm hit on a Tuesday night, bringing with it winds that howled like wild animals and snow that fell so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. Margaret had lived through many prairie winters, but this one felt different. It's more dangerous somehow. She woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something banging against the house. The wind was so strong it was rattling the windows and making the whole building shake. Margaret wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and crept to the window to look outside. Through the swirling snow, she could barely make out the barn, but she could see a faint light. Moving around near the livestock pen, Thomas was out there in the storm. Margaret's heart jumped into her throat. What was he doing outside in weather like this? She quickly dressed and made her way to the kitchen, where she lit a lantern and peered out the back door. The wind nearly knocked her over as she opened it, and the cold bit through her clothes like knives. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. She was about to go back inside when she saw him stumbling toward the house, carrying something in his arms. As he got closer, she realized it was one of the newborn calves, barely a week old. Thomas was soaked through and shivering, but he was holding the calf carefully against his chest, protecting it from the worst of the wind and snow. The barn door came loose. He gasped as he reached the porch. The animals were getting scattered. I got most of them back, but this little one was nearly frozen. Margaret quickly opened the door wider and helped him bring the calf inside. They set it down near the kitchen stove, and Margaret ran to get some old towels to dry it off. The calf was weak and cold, but alive. You could have been killed out there, Margaret said, looking at Thomas with a mixture of anger and concern. Why didn't you wake me up? Thomas was dripping wet and shaking from the cold, but he was focused entirely on the calf. I didn't want to worry you, he said, rubbing the animal's fur with the towel. And there wasn't time. If I had waited any longer, we would have lost half the herd. Margaret stared at him in amazement. Here was a man who had risked his life in a blizzard to save animals that didn't even belong to him. A man who was more concerned about her worrying than about his own safety. You need to get out of those wet clothes, she said practically. You'll catch your death. Thomas nodded and started to head toward the door, but he swayed on his feet. Margaret caught his arm and was shocked by how hot his skin felt through the wet fabric. You're burning up, she said with alarm. I'm fine, Thomas insisted. But even as he said it, he had to lean against the door frame to steady himself. Margaret took charge immediately. You're not going back to that cold barn tonight. Lucy can sleep in my bed and you can have her room. No arguments. Thomas tried to protest, but he was too weak and feverish to put up much of a fight. Margaret helped him to Lucy's small bedroom and found some of her late husband's clothes that might fit him. Then she went to the kitchen to make hot tea and soup. Over the next 3 days, Thomas was sicker than Margaret had ever seen anyone be. His fever was so high that he talked in his sleep, rambling about things that made no sense. Margaret found herself sitting by his bedside for hours, wiping his forehead with cool cloths and trying to get him to sip water. The children were worried too. Lucy kept asking if Thomas was going to die like their father had. Samuel wanted to know if it was his fault because he had been playing with Thomas's tools the day before. Margaret reassured them both, but privately she was terrified. What if she lost Thomas just when she was beginning to realize how much he meant to them? On the second night of his illness, Thomas's fever broke, and he started talking more clearly. But what he said broke Margaret's heart.
What?
I'm sorry, he whispered, his eyes unfocused and glassy. I know I'm not what you wanted. I know I'm not good enough for you and the children. I tried so hard to be worthy of you, but I'm just a failure. I lost everything I ever had, and now I'm going to lose you too. Margaret felt tears stinging her eyes. Thomas, you're not a failure, she said softly. You're the best thing that's happened to us in a long time. But Thomas was lost in his fevered thoughts. My partner said I was stupid to trust people. He said I was too soft, too trusting. Maybe he was right. Maybe I don't deserve good things. Not true, Margaret said firmly, taking his burning hand in hers. You deserve every good thing in the world. You're kind and hardworking and gentle. You're nothing like that terrible man who cheated you. As Thomas continued to ramble in his fever, Margaret learned more about his past than he had ever told her while awake. She heard about how he had grown up in an orphanage, how he had worked his way through an apprenticeship by doing odd jobs, how he had saved every penny for years to start his own business. She learned that his business partner hadn't just stolen his money. He had been Thomas's only friend, the only person Thomas had ever trusted completely. I lived in the streets for 3 months, Thomas mumbled. Slept in doorways, ate scraps from behind restaurants. I wanted to die. But then I saw your advertisement in an old newspaper someone had thrown away. It was like a miracle. Chance. To have a family. To belong somewhere. Margaret squeezed his hand tighter. You do belong here, Thomas. You belong with us. By the 3rd morning, Thomas's fever had broken completely, and he was weak but lucid. Margaret brought him breakfast in bed, something she hadn't done for anyone since her late husband had been sick. I'm sorry, Thomas said as she set the tray down. I must have been a terrible burden. I hope I didn't say anything too foolish. While I was out of my head, Margaret sat down in the chair beside the bed. Thomas, I need to tell you something. These past few months, watching you work and seeing how you are with the children, I've come to realize something important. Thomas waited, his eyes anxious. When you got off that train looking like you hadn't eaten in weeks, I was disappointed. I'd imagined someone who would solve all my problems, someone who would make my life easier. But what I got was something much better. I don't understand, Thomas said quietly. Margaret took a deep breath. I got a partner, someone who works beside me instead of just for me, someone who loves my children like they were his own, someone who would risk his life in a blizzard to save our animals. I got a man who has shown me what real character looks like. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Margaret, let me finish, she said gently. Yesterday afternoon, while you were sleeping, my late husband's brother showed up unexpectedly. He had heard rumors in town about the vagrant I had taken in, and he came to set me straight. Thomas's face went pale. What did he say? I was making a fool of myself. He said I was putting the children in danger by trusting a stranger. He said I should send you away before you stole everything we had and disappeared in the night. Thomas closed his eyes. Maybe he was right. You'd be better off. No, Margaret said firmly. I told him he was wrong. I told him that you had done more for this farm and this family in 3 months than anyone else had done in years. I told him that my children were safer and happier with you here than they had been since their father died. And I told him that. If he couldn't see what a good man you are, then he wasn't welcome in my house. Thomas stared at her in amazement. You defended me? Of course I did, Thomas. I was looking for a hired hand when I placed that advertisement. What I found was something I didn't even know I needed. A man who would put our family's needs before his own comfort. Who would work himself sick to take care of us. Who would be patient and kind with 2 children who aren't even his own. Stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the farm that Thomas had helped transform. The fences were all repaired, the barn roof was solid, and even in the middle of winter, everything looked well-maintained and cared for. When Robert died, she said, I thought I would never trust another man with my heart or my children's future. But Thomas, you've shown me that love isn't about fancy clothes or money in the bank. It's about showing up every day and doing what needs to be done, even when it's hard. It's about putting the people you care about first. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Are you saying ... double quotes? Margaret turned back to him with a smile. I'm saying that I think it's time we made this arrangement official. If you're willing, I'd like you to be my husband, truly and completely. Not just a business arrangement, but a real marriage. The joy that spread across Thomas's face was brighter than any sunrise Margaret had ever seen. Margaret, I've been hoping you would say that since the day I arrived. I love you, and I love Lucy and Samuel like they were my own children. Then it's settled, Margaret said, leaning down to kiss his forehead. Soon as you're well enough to stand, we're going. To get married properly, and this time I don't care what anyone in town thinks about it. Christmas Eve arrived with a gentle snowfall that covered the farm in a blanket of sparkling white. Margaret stood at the kitchen window, watching Thomas and the children building a snowman in the front yard. Their laughter carried through the cold air, warming her heart in a way she hadn't felt since Robert's death over a year ago. Thomas had recovered completely from his illness, and the past month had been the happiest Margaret could remember in years. Every morning, she woke up to the sound of Thomas chopping wood or feeding the animals. Every evening, she fell asleep to the comforting knowledge that someone was watching over her family, someone who cared about them as much as she did. The children had changed too. Lucy no longer asked when Thomas was going to leave, and Samuel had started calling him Papa Thomas without being told to. They followed him around the farm like baby ducks, eager to help with every task and hanging. On his every word, tonight was special, though. Margaret had spent the afternoon preparing their best meal in months: roasted chicken, fresh bread, and even a small cake made with precious sugar she had been saving. But more importantly, tonight was when she planned to make their engagement official. She had been thinking about it for weeks, ever since that conversation in Lucy's bedroom when Thomas was sick. They had talked several times since then about getting married, but always in practical terms: when they would have the ceremony, where they would live, how to explain it to the children. Tonight Margaret wanted to make it about more than just practicality. "Mama, come see," Lucy called from outside. "Papa Thomas is making the snowman look like a real person." Margaret wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto the porch. Thomas had indeed created an impressive snowman, complete with stones for buttons and a carrot nose. But what made her smile was seeing him with the children, his face bright with genuine joy as he helped Samuel place a stick arm in just the right position. "He needs a hat," Samuel declared, looking up at Thomas seriously. "You're absolutely right," Thomas agreed. "A fine gentleman like this definitely needs a proper hat." Thomas took off his own worn hat and placed it carefully on the snowman's head. It was the same hat he had been wearing when he got off the train 3 months ago. It's battered and faded, but always clean and neat. "Now he looks perfect," Lucy announced with satisfaction as they all came inside. Shaking snow off their clothes and stamping their feet by the door, Margaret felt a wave of contentment wash over her. This was what a home should feel like, full of warmth and laughter and people who cared about each other. Dinner was a celebration. Even though they were celebrating nothing more than being together, Thomas told funny stories about his apprenticeship days, making the children giggle until they nearly fell off their chairs. Margaret found herself laughing too, something that had become easier and more natural over the past few weeks. After the children went to bed, Margaret and Thomas sat by the fireplace, enjoying the peaceful quiet. Thomas was working on something, with his hands, carving carefully with the small knife he always carried. He had been working on this mysterious project for several evenings, always putting it away when anyone came near. "What are you making?" Margaret asked, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. Thomas looked up with a shy smile. "Actually, it's for you. I was hoping to finish it tonight." He held up a small wooden box, beautifully crafted with smooth, rounded edges and a tight-fitting lid. The wood was polished to a warm glow, and Margaret could see tiny flowers carved delicately around the sides. "Thomas, it's beautiful," she breathed, taking the box carefully in her hands. "I've never seen such fine work." "Open it," he said quietly. Inside the box, nestled on a bed of soft fabric that looked like it had been cut from Thomas's best shirt, was a simple ring made of braided wire. It wasn't gold or silver, just copper wire that Thomas had somehow shaped and twisted into an intricate pattern that looked like tiny leaves and vines. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas, I know it's not much," he said quickly, his voice full of nervous energy. I couldn't afford to buy you a proper ring, so I made this from some old wire I found in the barn. I wanted to give you something when we got engaged. Something that showed how much this means to me." Margaret looked at the ring, then at Thomas's anxious face. "It's the most beautiful ring I've ever seen," she said honestly, "because you made it with your own hands just for me." Thomas relaxed, relief visible on his face. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. When I got off that train 3 months ago, I was hoping for a roof over my head and regular meals. I thought if I worked hard enough, maybe you would let me stay. I never dreamed that I would find a real family, people who would care about me the way you and the children do." Margaret set the box carefully on the table beside her chair and moved to sit closer to Thomas on the small sofa. "Thomas, when I placed that advertisement, I was looking for someone to solve my problems. I wanted a husband who would take care of everything, so I wouldn't have to worry anymore." Thomas nodded, his expression serious. "But what I got was so much better than what I wanted," Margaret continued. "I got a partner who works beside me instead of just taking over. I got someone who loves my children and treats them with kindness and respect. I got a man who shows me every day what it means to put family first." She picked up the wire ring and held it up to catch the firelight. "This ring means more to me than any expensive jewelry ever could, because it represents everything. You are creative, hardworking, thoughtful, and loving." Thomas took her hands in his. "Will you marry me, Margaret? Really marry me? Not just for convenience, but because we choose each other?" "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas McKenna. I will marry you because you are the kindest man I've ever known, because you make me laugh, because you've shown my children what it means to have a father who truly cares about them." Thomas slipped the wire ring onto her finger, and Margaret was surprised by how perfectly it fit. "How did you know my size?" Thomas blushed slightly. "I may have borrowed one of your other rings for a few minutes to check," he admitted. Margaret laughed and kissed him gently. It was their first real kiss, soft and sweet and full of promise. "When should we have the wedding?" Thomas asked. "New Year's Day," Margaret said immediately. "I want to start the new year as your wife, officially and completely." The next week passed in a blur of preparations. Margaret altered her mother's wedding dress, which had been carefully stored in a trunk upstairs. Thomas used some of the money he had earned doing carpentry work in town to buy himself a proper suit, not fancy, but clean and new in his own. The children were beyond excited. Lucy appointed herself the flower girl and spent hours picking dried flowers and greenery to make a bouquet. Samuel practiced walking slowly and seriously, preparing for his important job of carrying the rings during the ceremony on New Year's Day, 1887. The small church was filled with more people than Margaret had expected. Mrs. Henderson was there, of course beaming with pride at her role in bringing them together. Several other neighbors who had come to respect Thomas over the past few months attended as well. Even some of the townspeople who had whispered and stared when Thomas first arrived seemed genuinely happy for them. Margaret walked down the aisle in her mother's dress, feeling more beautiful and confident than she had in years. Thomas waited for her at the altar in his new suit, and the expression on his face when he saw her made her heart skip a beat. He looked at her like she was the most precious thing in the world. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When they exchanged vows, Thomas promised to love and protect Margaret and her children for the rest of his life. Margaret promised to stand by Thomas through whatever challenges they might face together. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas kissed his new bride as Lucy threw flower petals and Samuel cheered loudly. The small congregation applauded, and Margaret felt like her heart might burst with happiness. At the simple reception afterward, Mrs. Henderson pulled Margaret aside. "I have to tell you," she said with tears in her eyes when I first suggested. "You find a husband through the newspapers. I was worried I was giving you terrible advice. But looking at you now, seeing how happy you and the children are, I know it was the best thing that could have happened." Margaret hugged her friend tightly. "You're right. Thomas arriving in those old clothes was the best thing that ever happened. To us, it taught me not to judge people by what they look like on the outside." Years later, when Margaret was a grandmother surrounded by children and grandchildren, She would often tell the story of how their grandfather had arrived at the train station with nothing but an old bag and a heart full of hope. She would show them the wooden box he had made and the wire ring that she never took off, explaining how real love wasn't about money or fancy things, but about finding someone who would work beside you, laugh with you, and put your happiness before their own. And whenever young people in the family were struggling with difficult decisions or facing hard times, Margaret would remind them that sometimes the best things in life come in unexpected packages, and that true worth has nothing to do with appearances and everything to do with character, kindness, and the willingness to keep trying.